Welcome to All Things Africa, the podcast. Listen in as Levy, Mike, and Linda discuss socio-political and economic current events and how they affect Africans worldwide. On this episode of All Things Africa, we are continuing our discussion from the previous podcast. We want to know, what are some cultural considerations in the battle against COVID-19 in Africa? What about political considerations? Let's pick up where we left off.
I like that point. I think that's a much bigger picture point to think about. What can we learn from this challenge?
Right.
From trying out different solutions and learning from them immediately. And I guess it's also being intentional about learning and being intentional about recording those lessons we learn from this particular challenge, because challenges will always come, especially those that, create these situations of unknown unknowns where you don't know what to do about them. But even a case in point, South Africa, according to certain experts, is that they were able to sort of take the lessons that they learned from the HIV epidemic and see how to move forward. And one of the things they learned is that you need to engage various stakeholders in the battle against HIV, and they've repeated learning from that. I like that point because it means that we can think in terms of how do we also just create relationships between government, communities, local government. Going back to the point, Mike, you made about trust and relationships. I read a case this weekend in Kenya. I don't know if you know this organization called Shofco. It's an organization that does work in the slums in Kenya, in the two major slums in Kenya. And the leader of that organization is apparently in one of the government committees that's dealing with the COVID situation. And he was saying that as someone who is on both sides, where he sits in this committee on government, and on the other side he's worked in Kibera and Mathare, which are two big slums, when he goes back to their communities and works with them, what he finds is that people don't trust the government enough to actually go with what the government wants them to do. And he's also echoing that same message. We need to learn how to trust each other. We need to learn how to work together from top and bottom. Yeah, but because this is not, like Mike says, not the last challenge. But from this challenge, we can learn a lot.
I agree. And I hope that most of these governments and these countries learn the importance of infrastructure, having proper plumbing, proper irrigation, proper, electricity for people, a good economy where people can find work, well-paying work that they can either save money for times like this, or those companies are able to support their income for a period of time, if need be. And the lack of all of these things is leading to the large number of cases. And, while the numbers may not seem that large in Africa, people have to remember that they're probably not testing as much as they are in other places, And when you don't test, you can't confirm for sure whether people have COVID or not. But if we notice the number of people dying in communities, I don't know about your communities, but we've had a high number of people dying in our communities back home. And we know that it's related to people gathering. And after that, there's been a bunch of cases of people being sick and whatnot. And those that are capable of getting tests are tested and found positive. But others, they don't know whether they're positive or not, but we see them getting sicker and sicker by the minute. And so we know that there's no other sicknesses going around. So it's gotta be COVID in these situations. But I think of the number of cases that could be mitigated if people have access to water in their homes, have electricity in their homes, if they had employment opportunities that allow them to have a larger income so that they can save a portion of their money for times like these, because it's only those situations that are allowing people to be able to remain home and to be more socially distanced and lower their chances of spreading or catching the virus, And so hopefully our governments are paying attention to the importance of these things, because it's more than just money at the time. It's future concerns that come up, that if you don't lay that proper infrastructure now, it makes it very difficult in times of a pandemic or any epidemic, that you won't be able to properly win the hearts of the people. Because if you were properly providing services all along, there wouldn't be this distrust between government and the people. If you've been providing our needs, then when the time comes, I trust that you'll be able to continue providing our needs through a pandemic.
And that's part of exactly why if I was a politician, a corrupt politician in Africa, or an oligarch, to me, this would tell me that there's a certain infrastructure building project, economic empowerment is beginning to be a minimum for stability in African countries. Without that, you are constantly allowing an inflammatory environment to exist. And it will only take one thing, and you don't know when that thing is going to come.
Yeah.
You don't know when, what angle, you don't know. But as long as a certain environment is still prevailing, then there's that increased risk, especially with so many different things changing about societies today or the world today.
Yeah.
I believe, just like what you're saying, it's not even from beyond that. There's a certain, just for stability, there's a certain minimum we need to get to before, so it's in the interest, in my opinion, it is the interest of even the corrupt politicians to now make sure that infrastructure is actually built, so.
Yeah, I think it is the whole idea of the system, right? It doesn't have to be just health system, but it could be health system, economic system, political system, how you take the lessons you're learning from this situation that has revealed the weaknesses in that system, and think proactively, like Mike is saying, in terms of how do you think proactively, but also think futuristically, in the sense that you don't just prepare for today, you don't react to today as a government, but how do you also think proactively in terms of the future? How do you sort of prepare for the future? Some of the studies that have looked at some of the Asian countries that have been able to sustain this, a few of them have not had a high number of cases. And what they found was that what happened is that in those countries, they already had experience from the previous strains of SARS, which, COVID is sort of that strain. And because of those previous experiences, when they reacted during that particular period, they built hospitals, they built emergency hospitals, they sort of built all these facilities, bought equipment, and had all these things in place ready for the next one. And it was partly reacting to that particular strain at that particular moment. But even then, there was already sort of emergency sort of facilities built in that reaction, so that if it ever comes back again, that was a great opportunity to prepare for what the future may look like or may come. And I guess in this case, even if you take, for example, during lockdown, I read this case of Nairobi metropolitan area where the head of Nairobi metropolitan was saying, during lockdown, people are at home, the streets are empty, everything is sort of available for us to work on and repair and rebuild and be ready to go back, because there is an opportunity within that moment to do what you couldn't do. Traffic is less, you don't have to deal with diverting traffic, people are at home. Yes, it's opportunistic, but it's actually, you have a chance to do what you couldn't do, because that window may never come again that easy. And so this could be a good time for governments to think in terms of doing exactly those things that prepare for the next challenge.
Absolutely. Or don't wait until it's election time to start paying people off. How about buying them food now? Buy food and send it to where they are, right? We understand the corrupt behaviors of some politicians, but maybe this is a good time for them to win the hearts of people by taking care of them through this pandemic. That might work. I don't know. Whatever keeps the people alive.
But to your point earlier, it comes back to doing it with an understanding of everyone's perspective, doing it with empathy, being ethical about it, because, you know, balance, now governments are having to balance between what's good for individuals, like what's good for the elderly who may be individuals, what's good for society. Because now you see some decisions that are made for the society as a whole, but they may not necessarily good for the individual, because there is an ethical question there, in the sense that if it's good for the society, then from an ethical and a moral perspective, the question should be that the individual should not be forgotten. But also, to your point earlier, Linda, that the experiences of women and the experiences of children, the experiences of a lot of people have to be taken into consideration, because they could be, in the moment, forget that other people have valid experiences that could inform what should be done. Like you documented in detail very well the experience of a woman who wakes up and feeds the family and goes to the market and comes home and continues to do these things. And that particular lived experience has a lot of insights that could inform what needs to be done, not for this moment, but just thinking in terms of what are the values that moving forward sustain a society that has a culture of taking care of everyone, even in the moment of crisis.
Have you guys heard this conspiracy theory that the governments could be doing a better job, but they're not, because that will cut off their access to funding, COVID funding?
Yeah.
Heard of that.
Heard of that as well.
Yeah. A lot of.
Heard of that?
Yeah, because the higher the number, the more help financially that they could get.
Right. Right. So you can kind of extend.
And you know, that mindset has been around for a long time, right? I think that's partly why some countries are so dependent on aid, because if they have aid money coming in to handle food or, you know, health services, all those things, then, you know, the leadership can just pocket whatever money they bring in from actual sectors that, you know, that are being managed, you know, whether it's agriculture or primarily, this happens a lot with oil countries where, you know, they have all this oil money, but somehow they're not able to provide services. They can't build infrastructure. They're not doing any of those other things. And it's because they depend on that foreign money to come in and take care of those other issues for them, so that they can continue to pocket money, because they have the funds. But then
it also could be, like you say, you know, it's one of those things where it might not even necessarily be about the dependency, but it could also be about seeing an opportunity to, you know, get enriched because contracts will be facilitated through the funding.
Yes.
You know, which, as we know, could then be distributed to, you know, certain connected individuals. So it might not even be about the dependent. They just know this is a gap. This is not going to last forever. So we can get a contract to, I don't know, distribute math to the country or something like that.
Yeah.
If it works out. Yeah.
Yeah. And we know this has to be true, because a lot of those places that say, oh, we have no tests, but then certain individuals are able to get tests. So where'd they get a test from?
Yeah. I
guess
even in the timing of the availability of things like gloves and sanitizer, you know, that that 2-week gap, or where one person has the dominance in the market, and then before, you know, more supplies arrive, that's significant.
Yeah.
You know, opportunity to be enriched.
And I think in some countries, COVID happened at a time when the context was full of corruption. The tendering process was full of corruption. Accountability was lacking. And so what happens in those kinds of contexts is something like this just creates more opportunities for those who are benefiting from those ill-structured processes and from those corrupt practices. Because for them, the situation continues to be a situation about profiting, right? So they've always thought of the situation as a profiting situation, and now more resources to profit from. And so the lesson to be learned then is that, you know, if you're talking about lessons, we need to have more accountable systems. We need to have tender processes that can be scrutinized thoroughly. Because in the event that you face another situation and that doesn't change, which is a good point Mike you brought, you will still end up with the same problems.
Mm-hmm.
If the newspaper accounts in Kenya were accurate or are accurate to go with, the earlier sort of stages of dealing with COVID were marred by cases of disappearing funds.
Mm-hmm.
The newspapers were tracking these funds, and I'm going by them because the stories are there.
Mm-hmm.
They were tracking these funds, and there was no paperwork for disbursing funds. No one was able to answer questions that were easy to answer. Money was disappearing instead of going where it's supposed to go.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do have that immediate greed that kicks in when more money starts coming in, and this money was being generously given. But it's a very structurally deep-rooted problem in certain places where you have to go deeper in terms of what are these causes of corruption and horrible tender processes that create these opportunities for those who see this as a profiting situation as opposed to a situation to improve their lives and prevent deaths for others.
Mm-hmm.
And that has happened here too, huh? It has happened here also.
Oh, yes.
There have been things
Mm-hmm.
that have been brought to light that really are exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Out of greed and opportunism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's a challenge of society, because for society, you always have some people who see it as an opportunity. Some people see it as a situation to save lives. Some people see it. I remember one leading health expert in the US asked a very poignant question: is how many more deaths do you have to sustain in order to justify economic growth?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not an easy question to answer, but then you do see how you have someone who may be looking at it as a perspective of, we need to reopen so economy can grow, which is what we are seeing even right now today.
Mm-hmm.
That discussion of economies need to grow, so let's stay open. And then you have cases of COVID increasing significantly, and others saying, well, if we go back to lockdown, then economy will crash, and all these other people, yes, you can save them. So it's not an easy situation to solve, but the point is that in this situation, there are a lot of people looking at it from different perspectives.
Yes.
And maybe the truth to recognize is as hard as it is to account for what perspectives are shaping the reactions that are being taken. Those who see it as economic, those who see it as a health problem, those who see it as a philosophical problem, those who see it as they will all be all these dimensions to think about the situation from. And if you ignore them, then you end up realizing some people just were in it for the money. And that's it. There was nothing else they were in it for.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, when you think about how many people have to die in order for us to shut things back down, right, for economic reasons. And a part of that question needs to be, who is it that's dying that we're okay with? Because, especially here in the US, what we've seen is that it's a large percentage of those that are dying are African Americans and minority communities and low income communities. And so if they are not my voting base, then I don't care if they're dying, right? And that's what unfortunately is starting to happen is for political reasons, they will reopen economy because who votes for them wants the economy open. But who votes for them is not the population that's dying out. And so they don't care quite as much because it's not their voting base. Now, if it was a different president and that voting base was the one that was at risk, then it would be a different situation. And I think that's important to know, because I'm sure we could probably see this in Africa as well. If a leader is in power, their communities are usually taken care of somehow. They will move even state funds to take care of their community, but they won't. But they will ignore the other communities, or they don't mind that the other communities are deteriorating because they're not their base, or they're not the ones that keep them in power.
And that's the thing that we were saying earlier. So you have, just like you're saying, you're ignoring this base that you don't really have to deal with, right? But now that same base is one of the pressure points that is then threatening you and your agenda. And Mitch McConnell said, and I'm going to rephrase, he said that he's talking about in terms of the need to look at police reforms, right? And whatever he said, I don't want to paraphrase wrongly, he basically agreed. Now, it could be political maneuvering. He basically agreed that it is time to look at, what could be reformed about policing. Now, it could be complete political maneuvering, but the fact that it is a maneuver that he has to pay attention to in order to make.
Yeah, he was forced to it. Yeah,
is a point not to be ignored. And the source of that need is coming from this base that you were ignoring. That now you're realizing, that the top of the Republican Party is realizing, we need to think about how we can pivot more towards some kind of positioning or messaging that is, reflective of some kind of desire to work towards some kind of reforms. And if you think about the African context, lesson of that, as you were saying, you can't keep, if your policies and your style of governing is geared towards favoring either one or a small group of ethnic groups or people, eventually that side that you are ignoring, maybe by design, is going to threaten whatever agenda that you have in the first place, whatever selfish agenda that you have in the first place. So that's an interesting sort of parallel that I was kind of gathering from what you were saying, and but whether that's a lesson that's taken is a whole nother question.
Yeah, I like that question that Linda posed in terms of who is dying, who is being, the thing is, the bias we as humans have is, I may be in my house and say, oh, COVID is not affecting me, so I'm going to roam around and not care about it and not wear the mask when I need to wear it because I feel some invincibility, right? And I feel like I can protect my family. But I think the empathy, going back to the point of empathy you were talking about, is to be empathetic to that person who gets affected by COVID and to learn the experiences of someone who's affected by COVID. It is not nice. It is difficult. If you think about, even in a context, let's say like Mike is talking about back in Africa, when we have this fabric of society where we are so connected that one person's, especially let's say it's a breadwinner who gets sick, that can actually be very detrimental for all the people who depend on that person, because these intergenerational houses are very dependent on individuals' ability to bring something to the table. And if you think about it in that framework of a community, one person is just that number we say as one more person died could mean many more things if you think about how many more people get affected when one more person dies. How many children will have less food to eat? How many people will not be able to have that peace they need in that house? How many people will be running around to make sure this person gets medicine? How many more people will have to? So if you think about the scale of one person dying, is because I've had these cases, people say, oh, we only have 8,000 cases in Africa of death. But if you think about that one person who died and how many affected by that one person, and how if you multiply those 8,000 who died by how many people who are connected to them, then maybe people will understand the scale of the problem. Instead of saying, oh, that's why to get to bigger numbers like the US to be worried. But it's not the same context. It's a different context. A lower number of deaths could still be very detrimental to so many more people.
I think you make a great point there. If we keep looking at the numbers like they're just numbers and not people, you miss the point, and you're able to make decisions that impact people just because it's a small number. You know, I think about even the Black Lives Movement here in America that has kind of caught fire across the world. It's about humanizing those numbers, right? You instead of just saying it's just a number, you tell George Floyd's story. You see it, and they got this campaign going, say their names, right? So you say their names because then you realize it's a real person, and you meet their families on those things, and you talk about what it all impacts. And he has a daughter, and all of these things start to unravel, and then it builds more consensus of like, no, this is a real problem. Because it was easy to just say, oh, it's only 600 Black men that are getting killed every day. But it's hard to say, you know what, is this Black man who's involved with his church, who had a child, who was improving his life, and then this tragedy took place, right? And so now you're able to build a consensus like, no, this is not fair. This is not fair. Previously, they were just numbers. And if their name was brought up, then the media might bring up a story about how they were previously a criminal. And it just begs the question, right? Or avoids it. Let's move away from making this person seem like a real person. And I think that's important with the coronavirus is we're not getting enough individual stories out there. Part of it is stigma. People don't want to share that they had it, and they don't want to let anybody know. Even if they survived it, they don't want to tell people. But by doing that, then you're putting a face to the disease and to the virus and to the issue, and so that people can actually pay attention to it. So when I see that, you know, the U.S. has over 2 million people with the virus, it's a real number, you know. It's like it's a city within the state of Florida. A whole city could be affected. That's huge. You know, you got to put it in terms that we can understand, and people have to share their stories more so that they realize it's a real thing. When I hear people talking about, yeah, before the virus, I was able to do X, Y, Z. Now I've lost my job. The stimulus that was supposed to cover supposedly supposed to cover 3 months of bills and expenses, $1,200. It's like, you're completely out of touch, government. Who can live on $1,200 for 3 months? That's ridiculous in this US, right? So it reminds you of the real challenges on the ground. While the government goes, oh, this is a fix, we've already done this, we've already done that. When you hear from people on the ground, you realize that the severity of the situation and the human aspect to it, which should create some empathy. Now, when I think about these politicians, they do need to pay attention to these communities that they don't think is important, because that's how uprisings happen, right? For a period of time, the people just deal with it. They deal with something. Eventually will break the camel's back, right? That'll be the straw that did it. It's just way too heavy. And when that time comes, you're gone. You know, you'll be overthrown, or they will push you out of office, or whatever the case is. They'll finally show up, and they'll make enough noise. And
not just that, it could also be that seed that then develops into something else. You know, I don't know if you've ever heard some of the stories around why certain geopolitical realities are what they are. And if you follow the backstory, it just backdates into some set of events that are so far removed from what it is today, but there was a seed that the outcome started to grow from.
Yeah.
And it's stuff like this that, you know, even if as a government you might feel confident in your ability to sort of manage any maybe drop in confidence in the government that might come out of this, you still are vulnerable to whatever seed it has already implanted. And you have to do better either way, because there's probably a risk to you that's nurturing in the environment. That's what I was saying, that inflammatory environment, to me, becoming a if you want stability in your country, because just like you're saying, you never know what that whatever that last straw is going to be. It could be, you never know.
I like that point of stability, because when you just look at the numbers in the US and say, okay, in the US we are looking at 2-point-something million, and you say, oh, in Africa we are looking at 330 or so thousand, and you say, oh, the cases are not that many. But I guess it goes, if we go back to that point about the fabric of the society, it's not the same. I mean, if you think about the 300,000, you have to think about multiplying it in terms of how many more people are affected, and one person gets affected in those contexts. Mike made this very good point about, in the case in the US, you can approach it as an individual and say, I'm an individual, so this 2-point-something million could account for the individual, arguably. But in a case where society depends on communal living or communal assisting each other, living in the house together as a group, and maybe Linda, let me take you for example. Let's say Linda gets sick, and Linda is hit by COVID, and Linda is working hourly, and Linda has been set back for 2 weeks to stay home and not work. You can just imagine how many more people Linda represents. Like that one person you thought of in that house as Linda, her being sick affects about 6 to 7 other people who depend on that job, right? So that number, yes, death is different from living standards, or death is different from well-being, but the well-being of those who get affected because that one person dies is huge. And even let's say one person dies and you have to find money to bury that person in a context where people fundraise for each other and do all these things, and then you have everybody's broke. The stress that comes with it is also so significant. So we can be so focused on death and forget all those other sort of factors that are related to that death that bring down the well-being of people and destabilizes societies that depend on that structure to hold.
Join us for the next episode of All Things Africa with Levy, Mike, and Linda. To get instant notifications on new episodes, subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to our podcast, or find us on Anchor at anchor.fm/allthingsafrica. Follow us on Twitter and keep the conversation going with the hashtag AllThingsAfrica.